Every year in the UK, 60,000 babies are born prematurely. This is the number one cause of newborn deaths. This is the harsh reality of families of babies born too soon.
Charlie was born at 31 weeks after I went through a pretty traumatic experience of hemorrhaging during my pregnancy, and basically for the ongoing safety of me and my baby, we had to have an emergency C-section. Within, I suppose, maybe 15 minutes of them deciding that I was going to have my baby, I was in the theatre and my baby had been taken away. And I think that was the start of our quite traumatic experience, really, and my introduction to motherhood.
The happiness, plans and excitement associated with a birth are replaced with helplessness, anxiety and isolation for many, but heartache for all.
At our 12-week scan, we found out we were having twins, which was a huge shock. Identical twins, so it's not hereditary, it's just spontaneous. We were very excited, a bit scared, but generally, generally very excited. And I had lots of extra scans because I don't think I really understood at the time. Twin pregnancies are higher risk, so there's a lot more risk of something going wrong. Around 20 weeks, I think, maybe just after 20 weeks, they noticed I had too much amniotic fluid, so I had polyhydramnios, and that sort of explained quite a lot of the pain that I was in. I was just the day before I was due to go in to have some of the amniotic fluid drained off, I went in spontaneous labour. So at 27 plus 6 weeks, my waters broke purely from the pressure of the amniotic fluid building up. I was just terrified that there might be something wrong. Something might have happened, that they wouldn't cry when they were born, that I don't know. It was all just a bit, it's bizarre, the things that you remember.
Nothing can prepare these mothers for the rollercoaster of conflicting emotions, financial strain and the vulnerability that overnight becomes a way of life.
Samuel was born very early. He was born at 30 weeks. It was a complete shock. He came very suddenly. My waters broke. I went straight up to the hospital, and within a couple of hours I had a new baby. Although I didn't really feel like I had a new baby because he wasn't with me. He was taken straight to neonatal intensive care. We could only see him a few hours later, and then later that evening I went home without him. It was all a bit of a whirlwind, so leaving the hospital didn't feel real, but it really hit home when I got into bed that night. I felt completely empty, and it was almost like I was grieving for a baby that I'd lost. That morning I'd been pregnant, I'd had a baby, but my baby wasn't there with me. There was a real sense of emptiness and grief.
Initially, it's disbelief. I remember lying in my hospital bed the morning, later on that morning, totally in disbelief of what had just happened. A few hours previously had felt my baby inside me, and then suddenly there was nothing there, and I hadn't even got to hold my baby or touch my baby before he was taken away down the corridor. This was not the start of motherhood that I was expecting. I think, like so many people, you have this ideal of, you have your baby, you hold them in your arms, you look into their eyes lovingly, and obviously I didn't get to have that. And I think a lot of mothers who've had premature babies feel the same, where you feel robbed of that moment, and you never get that chance again.
It was probably a full 12 hours later that I saw Charlotte saw both of them for the first time. But by that point, Eva was getting ready to be transferred to another hospital. They discovered that she had a condition called tracheoesophageal fistula. Her esophagus hadn't formed properly, so there was a gap between her mouth and her stomach, so she had effectively had a pouch. So she was getting prepared to be transferred to another hospital for surgery. I saw her very briefly, but I wasn't allowed to touch her at that point. And Charlotte I held, so probably 12 hours after birth. I held for a few minutes.
Before Samuel was born, Katrina had experience of working with premature babies as an occupational therapist.
I remember on his second day in intensive care, my husband said to me, "Do babies die born at 30 weeks?" And I had to say to him, no, they don't die, babies born at this age. But thinking back to the babies that I had treated at that gestation who had, and Samuel had his ups and downs, and there were moments that you just sort of thought, is this not going to be a happy ending? But luckily for us, it was, and it's very hard being in a neonatal unit surrounded by so many other babies and so many other families going through their own journeys. You start to feel guilty sometimes when you're feeling sorry for yourself, thinking about your own circumstances. And, like I said, I went home and I would feel empty and grieve for the baby that wasn't with me. And then I'd feel guilty that I was grieving for a baby that actually I still did have, and that other mums weren't as lucky as I was.
You're walking out empty-handed and not really knowing what was going to happen whilst you were away from the hospital, because things could change within minutes, really. I always remember the nurses and doctors saying, whenever I wanted reassurance that it's the time thing, that you just have to wait, and something could just change at any one point and he could be stable now. But the word that kept being used was infection. So if he gets an infection, then everything can change. So we just had to keep hoping that he wouldn't get an infection of any sort. We didn't know at that point whether he was brain damaged or he'd have issues of any sort. You just don't know, you just have to wait.
Eva, I didn't get to hold for 2 weeks, until 2 weeks after she was born, because she had to have surgery and she was extremely ill in intensive care. I thought, how on earth am I going to cope? Because I've got two very premature, very sick babies in 2 different hospitals. And thankfully, Charlotte was then, the following day, she was transferred to Chelsea and Westminster. So she was then transferred to the same hospital Eva was in. But I didn't see Eva for 5 days, although Dave, my partner, was with her for all of that time. And I think that was when we started realising we both needed to be in 2 places at the same time. And our answer to that often was that one would go with one baby and one would be with the other one, because that was the best we could do.
Matt went off to work in the morning, I went to the hospital. I stayed all day until either Matt came to join me in the evening and we had tea at the hospital, or I came home, we had tea, and then we went back to the hospital in the evening and stayed there until 11, 12 o'clock at night. I had this real sense of needing Charlie to hear my voice and know that I was there. Where when you're normally carrying your baby, that baby is with you the whole time, and I wanted to give him as much of that as I could.
Eva had a much more complicated journey through neonatal care, and she had to have a few operations to try and fix her esophagus. She was in neonatal care for 6 months altogether, 197 days. But unfortunately, the last operation she had, which we thought was going to be the final one to fix her esophagus, she suffered catastrophic brain damage, so she never woke up from that operation. And so she came home in a coma on day 197, and she died 4 days later at home with us. It wasn't really Eva who we brought home. It was more her body that was still just about going. But she, before the operation, she was smiling and she was a wriggly baby. She was really nosy. She started to make cooing sounds. She'd recognise us. She was feeding well. She was relatively healthy apart from this sort of problem with her esophagus. Everything else she was developing normally. So it was a huge shock when we were told after the operation that she'd suffered from brain damage.
There was a real emptiness where I felt that I missed out on holding my baby. I waited 6 days to be able to hold him, and those 6 days were a very long, anxious 6 days, very up and down. And I sort of thought, yes, I'm going to finally hold him. But actually, when you finally get to hold a baby who's on a life support machine, it's terrifying because he's still on a ventilator, he still has a tube in his mouth, he's still hooked up to lots of wires and alarms, and every sort of movement can affect their heart rate, their breathing rates. So of course the monitors are going crazy with all the lights and alarming and things like that. And I finally held him in my arms, and all I wanted to do was really cuddle him close. I wanted to be able to kiss him, and I wanted to spend time with my baby.
Charlotte was in hospital for 79 days in total. So they were born at 28 weeks, 3 months early. And Charlotte came home 5 days before their due date. She's got a heart defect that called a PDA, which is quite common for premature babies to develop. She also developed infections. She had to have blood transfusions. She sort of went, it was, 2 steps forward and one step back. There's 3 levels in the neonatal unit I was on. There's intensive care, high dependency, and then special care. And she was in high dependency for about half the time, and then she moved to special care. Through the journey of neonatal, it's the tiny little, you will hold on to any tiny little victory. It will be, she has gained 5 grams today. Everything that happened you felt was a step towards coming home. And then she'd get an infection and you felt like you'd gone back 10 steps.
I think that the whole of his first year I worried about his well-being. Even though he was fine, I was always worried that something was going to happen because he'd had such a traumatic start. But he'd probably more of a fighter because of his start. But I know that I did not enjoy motherhood as much as I could have done because of his beginning.
After she got home, like her first colds, and every time she got a cold, she would wheeze, and that would send me into a spiral of panic because I'd seen babies wheezing in hospital. I'd seen them needing to be resuscitated, not just my babies. In the neonatal unit, I saw huge resuscitations, saw babies crashing, huge resuscitations. I saw babies die. I had all of this in my head still, the flashbacks of all of this, and there in front of me was Charlotte wheezing, and I just thought the next breath is going to be her last breath. Charlotte knows she's a twin, and we've talked about Eva a lot, and we talk about Eva being in heaven. She'll be playing with a toy and it will come from nowhere, or she'll be eating her dinner, and she once said to me, she was eating her dinner and she said, "Do you think Eva likes spaghetti?" She said to me before, "Is heaven too far away for Eva to come to the Halloween disco at school?" And trying to explain death to a child is extremely difficult, and I think her understanding of it has changed as she's got older.
Neonatal care units have a price. There's no bonding or cuddles for weeks or months. Any overnight facilities cost families over £2,500. A staggering 40% increase of stress-related illnesses such as postnatal depression compared to just 5 to 10% of mothers who have full-term pregnancies. The Smallest Things campaign feel a change to maternity leave is needed.
At the moment, the UK legislation doesn't reflect the needs of babies born early. It's very sort of black and white that everything should go to plan. This is when a baby's born, and then you'll have your time off after that. But there are families for which they don't fit into that box. That isn't what they find their time to be. Months visiting a baby in intensive care, that isn't maternity leave. It's a strange thing. I sort of thought if some people knew about this, they would support it. Not many people know about the world of neonatal intensive care, and when they do find out about that world, they agree and think, gosh, that isn't what maternity leave should be like.
I had spent a lot of time of my maternity leave. There's a period of it in the hospital, but also afterwards I didn't really get to enjoy maternity leave like a lot of other mothers get to enjoy maternity leave. And I just felt also the start that I had with Charlie, I might not have had Charlie. It might have gone down a very different path, and I was very lucky to have him, and I wanted to spend the time, a bit more time with him before I went back to work. A lot of cases, babies will leave the hospital and then they have follow-up appointments. They get sick when they're at home because of, colds, chest infections, and it's not just the time they're in the hospital, then they go home and everything's normal. We had to clear our house, make it dust free. We had to be in quarantine for 2 weeks, and then before you know it, there's winter, and then you're sort of wrapping him up and making sure he doesn't go near anyone with colds or anything because he's more susceptible. But all these things can have an impact on your living and enjoying your baby and enjoying family life again.
I found out that my maternity leave had started the day after Sam was born. The doctor was telling us that we were likely to be in hospital for months, and then the health visitor said, have you spoken with work because your maternity leave would have started? And at first I thought she must be wrong, because I couldn't see how being in hospital with a critically ill baby in intensive care could be maternity leave.
The premature bill will hopefully give parents that much needed time with their babies. I think it's financial. There's a big financial issue here, but also it's emotional. And I resigned from my job. I felt I had no choice. I asked for extended unpaid leave, and that they were not able to give that to me. So my choice was either to go back or to resign. I would love in the future for parents who are on a neonatal unit to be talking about their maternity leave and to say, can you believe there was a time when they used to make your maternity leave start as soon as your baby was born, even if they were 3 months early? I mean, that's just crazy. And that's what I hope will happen.
Presently, the maternity and paternity laws remain unchanged. The families of Charlotte, Charlie and Samuel continue to fight for rights for parents of premature babies.